Good morning, Magic. I'm Gavin Verhey from Wizards of the Coast. And one thing that is crucial when building a deck is figuring out how many copies of any given card to put into that deck. Do you want 1, 2, 3, or 4 copies? Well, today I'm going to tell you exactly how to choose that number and how to apply it to your own deck building. Ready? Let's go. Now, if you're building a commander deck, the answer is pretty obvious. You can only play 1 copy of each card in your deck. But for every other format, you're going to need to choose between 1 and 4 copies. So how do you pick? Well, let me walk you through each of them. Let's start with 4 copies of a card. Cards that you play 4 copies of tend to be the strongest cards in your deck. You want to draw them every game. They might even be the reason why you are playing your deck in the first place. To quote some advice that Michael Jacob once gave me, a 4-of can't be a card that you're sad to draw 3 of. And I mostly agree. 4 good reasons to play a 4-of in your deck. First of all, it might just be incredibly powerful. Maybe it's one of the best cards in the format, or at least in your deck, and you just want to draw as many as you can over the course of a game. Even if it's expensive, you want these in your hand. Reason number 2, it's good early in the game. The more copies of a card you play, the more likely you are to have it in your opening hand. So if a card is really strong in the first few turns of the game, often you'll want to play 4 copies of it, even if it gets worse later in the game. Reason number 3, the card gets better the more you draw. Simply put, if it gets better the more you draw, you should probably have more of them in your deck to draw in the first place. For example, a creature type lord like Imperious Perfect is just going to get better the more you draw. And finally, reason number 4. The card is just good at all points in the game. If it's good early in the game, in the middle of the game, and at the end of the game, well, you probably want 4 copies of it. Now let's move on to talking about 3 copies of a card. Now, while 4-ofs are cards that you are always happy to draw, 3-ofs are a little more nuanced. I often think of 3-ofs as cards that you want to draw 1 of, or maybe 2 if the game goes really long. A few reasons why you might play a 3-of in your deck. First of all, it might just be a little expensive to cast. Maybe it's really strong, but it's a 5 or 6 drop card. You don't want a bunch of those in your hand early in the game, so you play it as a 3-of to draw 1 in the mid game. Reason number 2, the card is only good in certain situations. For example, it might be really good with other cards, but kind of weak on its own, like an aura. You don't really want to draw an aura until you have a creature to put it on. And drawing a hand of 3 auras and no creatures isn't really what you want. Reason number 3, you don't want to draw multiples early in the game. Maybe it's an enchantment that's redundant with extra copies, or maybe it's just a legendary creature that if you draw a second of, you couldn't play it early. By playing 3 of them, you're more likely to draw just 1. And finally, you might want to do what is called a split. This is where you take one grouping of card slots that's dedicated to a specific kind of effect and split it between multiple different cards. For example, let's look at removal spells. If you have 4 slots to dedicate to removal, you could play 4 copies of Go for the Throat. But if you're playing against an artifact deck, that might go pretty poorly for you. So by splitting it 3 copies of Go for the Throat and 1 copy of Heartless Act, it just gives you a little more variety. So you're less likely to draw 2 copies of Go for the Throat in a matchup where it's dead. Now let's move on to 2 copies of a card. And I'll let you know right now, 2 copies is my least favorite number in a deck. Often it means you were a little indecisive or couldn't figure out what the right card is to play. There are some correct reasons to do it, but you should be very careful when putting 2-ofs into your deck. Some of the good reasons are the following. Number 1, the card is extremely situational. For example, a card which is very good in some matchups and very bad in others. If you're going to do something like main deck color specific hate, 2-of is often a pretty good number for it. Reason number 2, the card is an expensive finisher. If it's 6, 7, 8, or even more mana, you'll find one if the game goes that long, especially if you're a control deck, and you definitely do not want it in your hand early in the game. Reason number 3, you just don't know if it's good or not. And this is kind of a cop-out answer, but it is a realistic one and sometimes will happen when you're building a deck. If you don't know if a card's going to be good in your deck, playing 2 means that you'll find it sometime so you can try it out, but you're not going to find it all the time if it's bad. And finally, reason number 4, you want to split or expand. Splits I just explained in the 3 section, and the same principle applies here. You might play 2 copies and 2 copies of similar removal spells, for example. Expanding is increasing the number of copies of a kind of effect you have above 4. For example, if you have 4 removal spells already in your deck and you want 2 more, well, you can't just play more copies of that first removal spell. So you might play a different removal spell as a 2-of to complement that first batch. And finally, 1-ofs. These are my guilty pleasures. I love throwing 1 or 2 1-ofs into a deck because they're just so awesome when you draw them out of nowhere and they totally turn the tide of the game. You will very rarely draw them, but a good strategically placed 1-of when you do, it's a total chef's kiss moment. It just feels awesome. 4 reasons why you might play a 1-of. First of all, it's a tutor target. If you're playing cards in your deck that search your library for specific cards, well, you're probably going to play some 1-ofs as silver bullets you'll want to find in specific situations. Number 2, the card might be extremely situational. Maybe you only want it in very specific circumstances, but it's really good in that circumstance. I'll note that the biggest difference in deck building is going from 0 copies of a card to 1 copy of a card because it gives you a chance to draw it. Number 3, the tactical 1-of. Maybe there's a card that you need to play in your deck so that a certain deck can't beat you, or you will find it going late. So for example, imagine that control is really prevalent and the game is going to go a long time in mini matchups. Playing 1 copy means you can find your absolute control breaking card. Or maybe if mill is really popular in the format, you would play 1 Eldrazi Titan to shuffle everything back in. Simply having 1 in your deck as a strategic move would completely change the course of that matchup. And finally, maybe you want to play a 1-of to split or expand like we did with 3-ofs and 2-ofs. Notably, I find that 1-ofs are often used to split or expand on game-ending threats. For example, maybe your control deck wants a mix of expensive finishers to kill your opponent with. So what do you think? Was this helpful to you? Are there other reasons why you might run different copies of cards in your deck? If so, let me know in the comments down below. I'll talk with you again on Friday. And in the meantime, may you have just the right 1-of for the occasion. You got this. Math Super Cycle will take that long. This started with World Wake in 2010, adding a color every time we saw Omnath again. But unless we wait to make the 5-color Omnath until 2030, that's not going to beat the Ling's Super Cycle run. Though, who knows? Maybe we can get there if we ever make a 5-color plus colorless mana Omnath.